You are listening to Whispers of Asia, where the dead don't sleep and old rituals still breathe beneath the soil. Every story is a shadow passed down in silence, waiting for someone to listen. In the heart of Asia, where jungle roots strangle forgotten temples and the air grows thick with incense and memory, there are stories that were never meant to be told aloud. They live in cracked bells that ring without wind, in stitched-mouthed monks buried beneath stone, in chants no longer taught in any monastery, but still whispered in dreams. These are not just ghost stories. They are spiritual scars, remnants of forbidden rites, karmic debts unpaid, and spirits too restless to pass on. Curses carried through generations, voices that echo in reverse, places where time and soul unravel. Tonight, we follow the story of a bell that should never have rung, a temple that was never truly abandoned, and a girl who heard something no one else could. Listen closely, because once you hear the bell, it's already too late.
Arisa hadn't heard silence in years. Bangkok was a city that hummed even at midnight. Neon lights buzzing, engines coughing, vendors shouting through the smoke. Silence had become a myth, something she thought existed only in temples and memories. Yet here, deep within the northern jungles of Chiang Rai, silence pressed against her like a living thing. It was not peace, it was weight, a stillness so complete it seemed to wait for her to breathe before it would continue existing. She wiped the sweat from her brow, brushing off a strand of hair that had glued itself to her cheek. The air smelled of moss, rot, and incense long extinguished. She carried her camera close to her chest like a relic, afraid that the thick vines might pull it from her hands. Her professor had told her to document spiritual decay, the way nature reclaims what faith leaves behind. Wat Sawan, the ruined temple hidden beyond the known forest trail, was perfect, but no one in the nearby village had wanted to take her there. They had offered her the same warning in different tones. Don't go after sunset, don't ring the bell, don't speak if you hear the chanting. She had smiled politely, thinking it was just folklore, old people clinging to ghosts. But as she trudged deeper into the green maze, those words began to weigh heavier. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place. Her guide, an old man named Thon, walked ahead of her with a machete, slicing through vines that hung like ropes. His shoulders hunched, as though he carried an invisible burden. When she tried to ask him why the villagers avoided Wat Sawan, he only muttered, "Because no one who goes there comes back the same." Then he stopped speaking altogether. By noon, the forest thickened until sunlight barely touched the ground. Arisa's camera clicked and hummed softly, ruined stupas buried in roots, walls carved with headless Buddhas, a staircase leading nowhere. Everything was broken, yet strangely preserved, as if time itself had hesitated to move forward. And then she saw it. At the center of the clearing stood the remains of a bell tower. The structure leaned slightly, overtaken by banyan roots that twisted up its sides like veins. The bronze bell still hung there, blackened by age, its surface etched with faint inscriptions she could not read. She raised her camera, adjusted the focus, and took a picture. The sound of the shutter cracked through the silence like thunder. Fawn flinched. "Don't," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This place remembers." She laughed nervously, pretending not to feel the chill that slipped beneath her skin. "It's just a bell." "No," he said, lowering his eyes. "It's not." He turned to leave, but Arisa wasn't ready. She wanted one more shot, one perfect frame. She stepped closer to the tower. The air felt heavier, the heat rising around her like a fever. She touched the cracked stone base, brushed away dust, and aimed upward again. The lens caught something, a faint shimmer, as though heat waves danced in the air, though the forest was still. Then she heard it. A bell rang. Once. Clear, deep, and close. Thawne froze mid-step. The sound seemed to roll through the jungle, yet the leaves didn't move. Arisa's breath hitched. The bell swayed slightly, but there was no wind, no one else nearby, no hands that could have moved it. She turned toward Thawne, expecting him to explain, to tell her it was just the echo of metal and memory. But the old man was already backing away, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that belonged to children, not grown men. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. "It heard you." "Who heard me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Thawne didn't answer. He dropped his machete and ran into the trees, leaving her alone with the sound still vibrating in the air. Arisa stood frozen for a long moment, her pulse drumming in her ears. The bell was still now, hanging motionless. She tried to laugh at herself, to shake off the superstition. Maybe the metal expanded in the heat. Maybe it was just her imagination. But when she reviewed her camera's footage, the last photo wasn't what she expected. The image of the bell was blurred, not by motion, but by something behind it. A shadow, faint, but unmistakably human, standing at the base of the tower. It had no face, only the outline of a monk's robe, and the glint of something metallic where its mouth should be. The forest was utterly still again. Yet in that silence, her heartbeat felt like footsteps. Arisa turned off her camera, packed it quickly, and began walking back toward the trail. But after only a few steps, she paused. She could still hear something, soft, rhythmic, like a chant carried on breath that wasn't her own. She told herself it was the wind. She told herself she was imagining it. But the sound grew clearer. A single voice, murmuring in a language she didn't know. The tone rose and fell like the tolling of a bell. Arisa clutched her bag and began to run. Behind her, the bell rang again, and this time, it didn't stop. Arisa didn't tell anyone in the village what she had heard. Not about the bell, not about the shadow in the photo, not about the chanting that seemed to follow her out of the forest like a scent clinging to her skin. She told herself it would pass, that she was just tired, dehydrated, too absorbed in her project, that if she said the words aloud, they would become real. She didn't sleep that night. The room the guest house had offered was simple. Wooden floors, a thin mattress on a raised platform, a single dusty fan circling like a tired prayer wheel. But the quiet wasn't comforting anymore. She kept thinking of the sound of the bell, of the echo that hadn't faded. It felt like it had followed her all the way here and curled into the walls. By morning, she was back on the trail, alone this time. Thawne was gone. He'd left without a word, without payment, leaving only the machete leaning against the guest house door. The forest greeted her like a beast pretending to sleep. Light filtered through the thick canopy in slivers, golden and green. The same path she had taken the day before seemed longer now, the vines thicker, the shadows darker, but she pressed on. She had to finish what she started. Wat Sawan revealed itself again slowly. First the archway crumbled with time, then the fractured stone pathway beneath her boots, and finally the temple itself, choked by banyan roots so thick they looked like limbs. It looked as though the trees were trying to strangle the ruin back into the earth. No birds, no wind. The bell tower stood tall at the center like a sentinel, watching over its fallen flock. The bell no longer swayed, but Arisa didn't trust it. She avoided looking directly at it. Instead, she moved through the ruins. Her camera hummed as she took photos of the broken stupas, the faded murals painted on crumbling walls, scenes of monks in meditation, of demons swirling in fire, of bodies wrapped in flame and ash. One mural showed a monk kneeling before a mass of shadows, a bell hanging above him, his mouth stitched shut. She zoomed in. The threads were red and fresh. She pulled away from the wall, heart thudding. The main hall, or what remained of it, was little more than collapsed stone columns and splintered beams. A headless Buddha sat at the far end, draped in moldy orange cloth that somehow hadn't disintegrated. At its feet were the remains of ritual offerings, dried lotus petals, broken clay urns, and coins so old their markings had vanished. But there was one thing that didn't fit. A bowl of rice, still warm, steam rising. She stared at it, her throat tightening. No footsteps, no voices, no signs of anyone nearby. She didn't touch it. Instead, she looked to the altar. Something had been scratched into the stone, not carved with tools, but gouged, deep, furious marks that formed crude characters. She took a photo, then looked down to the screen to examine them. But the screen glitched. The image refused to load. She tried again. Same result. Then the fan on her camera began to whine. A whisper rose behind her. She turned sharply. No one. But she knew she had heard it. A single word, drawn out in a breath that wasn't hers. Sawan. She backed away from the altar, camera still clutched tightly in her hands. The silence now was thick and pressing, heavy. She could feel it against her skin, her eyes, her ears. That was when she noticed it. The sound beneath the silence. A low hum, like something breathing. It was coming from the bell tower. Against her better judgment, she approached. The structure groaned with age as she stepped through the broken threshold. Stairs spiraled upward in the gloom, narrow and steep. She climbed slowly, each step creaking beneath her weight. The smell grew stronger, like incense, rotting fruit, and dried blood. At the top, she found the bell. It was larger than it looked from the ground, cracked but intact, covered in black oxidation and faint inscriptions that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The air around it felt wrong, thicker, like it was resisting her presence. She lifted her camera, but before she could take a photo, the floor beneath her groaned. The tower shuddered. For a moment, it felt like something under the ground had shifted, like a breath inhaled. She staggered back, nearly losing her balance. The bell did not move, but she could hear it again. Not ringing, whimpering. She stepped away, heart pounding, and descended the tower quickly. Back on the forest floor, the shadows had grown longer, but she hadn't been there long. It was too early for sunset. She checked her watch. It was dead. She pulled out her phone. Battery drained. She hadn't used it all day. The bell tones weren't echoes. They were invitations. She left the ruins in silence, refusing to look back. That night, she finally slept, but only for a few hours. And when she woke, her feet were dirty with forest soil, and her pillow was dusted with ash. That night, Arisa fell asleep with the taste of metal in her mouth. The air inside the small guesthouse room had turned heavy, as if it were breathing with her. The ceiling fan creaked above, spinning lazily, its blades cutting the shadows into trembling fragments. Outside, the jungle whispered. Crickets, frogs, the far-off call of a bird that sounded almost human. She dreamt before midnight. In the dream, she stood again at Wat Sawan. The temple was whole this time, glowing faintly under a veil of mist. Golden roofs shimmered, bells hung in perfect rows, swaying though the air was still. The monks chanted softly, but something about their voices was wrong. They were speaking backward, the syllables folded into themselves, each word unraveling as soon as it was formed. Arisa tried to move, but her feet were buried ankle-deep in ash. Every breath she took drew in incense smoke and dust. The monks turned as one, their faces hidden beneath decaying saffron hoods. One of them stepped forward, taller than the rest, his eyes sealed shut by dark thread, his mouth crudely stitched from ear to ear. In his hands he held the cracked bronze bell. He raised it to her face and smiled. When he struck it, the sound didn't echo, it entered her. The vibration ran through her bones, her teeth, the hollow spaces behind her eyes. Every time the bell rang, her body answered. She tried to scream, but no sound came out, only the tolling. Then she saw herself kneeling before the monk, lips moving, whispering the same backward chant. The bell between them glowed, and something, a shape, a shadow, slipped from her mouth into it. The monk turned the bell upside down, trapping whatever it was inside. The tolling grew faster, louder, until the sound filled the sky. The temple began to crumble, the monks burned away like paper. Only the bell remained, floating in the air, turning slowly. And then, silence. Arisa woke, gasping. Her room was drenched in darkness, except for the faint red light of the camera still charging on the desk. Her heart thundered as though it had been running for hours. The sheets were damp, her palms smeared with gray powder. She reached for the bedside lamp and froze. There, across her pillow, were streaks of black soot and a single fingerprint, not hers. She sat upright, breathing shallowly. Her camera light blinked again, twice, like a heartbeat. She unplugged it, turned it on, and scrolled through the photos she'd taken earlier that day. The images looked different now. The colors were colder, the shadows deeper. In one frame, a figure stood behind the altar she had photographed, a faint outline, half obscured by smoke. When she zoomed in, the outline became clearer. A bald head, a thin robe, eyes sewn shut. Her hand trembled. She checked another image. In this one, the bell tower, the same shimmer she had seen before, but now there was something else. Letters, etched faintly into the air itself, forming a circular pattern. When she adjusted the contrast, the shape appeared more defined, an old Thai script she didn't recognize, surrounding her own reflection. Then her camera clicked on its own. She hadn't pressed the shutter. A flash exploded, blinding her. The device fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, from somewhere inside the room, she heard it again, the faint, unmistakable sound of a bell. Not from outside, not from a distance, but close, intimate. It came from the desk, from the camera. She forced herself to look. The lens had cracked. Through the glass, she could see something moving, slowly, like smoke trapped inside. Her reflection twisted. The eyes in it blinked, though she hadn't. She threw a blanket over it and stumbled back, her pulse hammering in her skull. Outside, the wind rose suddenly. The windows rattled. From the darkness beyond, she thought she heard voices, low and layered, overlapping each other. They weren't speaking Thai. The sound had that same reversed rhythm she'd heard in her dream. She grabbed her bag and bolted from the room, stepping barefoot onto the dirt road outside. The air was damp with mist, the village sleeping behind her like a graveyard. She turned toward the forest. In the distance, faintly illuminated by moonlight, she saw the outline of the bell tower again, and she swore it was swaying. The bell tolled once, and the sound didn't fade. It followed her home. Morning light did not bring comfort. It spilled through the slats of Arisa's guest house window like the glow of an old wound, weak, colorless, and already fading. She hadn't slept since the dream. Her eyes stung from staring at the camera under the blanket for hours, afraid to touch it, afraid to look. The bell's echo was gone, but its memory remained, ringing somewhere deep inside her chest where no sound should live. She sat by the window, her fingers tracing the thin soot still clinging beneath her nails. Every time she brushed them clean, more appeared, as if her skin were remembering something her mind wanted to forget. At dawn, she decided to return to the temple. It wasn't bravery, just obsession, the kind that grows in the absence of logic. She told herself she needed answers, proof, something to photograph that would explain what was happening. If she could see it, she could understand it. The villagers avoided her eyes as she passed through the market. No one spoke to her. Only an old woman selling incense sticks muttered softly as Arisa walked by. The words were too low to catch, but Arisa recognized one, Sawan. At the edge of the forest, she found Than's machete again, leaning against the old fence. It was rusting now, as though weeks had passed instead of a single day. The forest looked unchanged, but she could feel it watching her. Every leaf seemed to listen. The path was harder to follow. The undergrowth was thicker, the air heavier. By the time she reached Wat Sawan, her shirt clung to her skin with sweat, and her heartbeat had merged with the rhythm of the jungle. She stopped at the entrance to the temple grounds. The bell tower stood exactly as before, but the rest of the ruins looked different now. The murals she had photographed were darker now, shapes blurred, faces smeared. The headless Buddha still sat in the hall, yet the offering bowl of rice was gone. In its place lay a wilted garland of marigolds and 3 incense sticks burnt halfway. Someone, or something, had been here since her last visit. "Who maintains this place?" she murmured. A voice behind her answered, calm and low. "No one living." She spun around. A man stood in the shade of a banyan tree, barefoot, wrapped in a faded saffron robe. His skin was the color of dried teak, his eyes clear but old, so old they seemed to have seen through centuries. A forest monk, she realized, the kind who wandered beyond society, unseen and often forgotten. "You shouldn't come here," he said gently. "The temple sleeps, but its dreams are restless." Arisa's throat tightened. "You know about the bell?" He nodded slowly. "Pra Anulom's bell. It is not meant to ring again." The name stirred something in her, familiar, yet distant, as if she had heard it whispered somewhere before. Who was he? The monk's gaze drifted to the ruined tower. "A man who tried to trap a storm in a bowl of water. Long ago, this place was not cursed. The monks here practiced a sacred mantra called Katasat, the chant of binding. It was meant to still the spirits of the angry dead. But to still suffering, one must first taste it." He stepped closer, his bare feet silent on the cracked stones. He sealed himself alive, chanted for 7 days without breath, without food. They found him in a kneeling position, skin like lacquer, lips sewn with red thread. The bell above him rang once, then fell silent. The villagers say the spirit was trapped inside, but the chant was never completed. Arisa's stomach turned cold. "Then it's still here?" "Yes, and now it knows your name."
She wanted to laugh, to reject the story as myth, but she couldn't. Every word felt too familiar, too heavy. How do I end it? You don't. He reached into the folds of his robe and took out a thin strip of palm leaf inscribed with curling Thai characters. You endure it. Before she could reply, he pressed it into her hand. The script burned faintly, the ink warm as breath. Keep this close, he said. When the bell calls again, do not answer. If you speak, it will bind you to its chant. She opened her mouth to ask more, but the monk had already stepped back into the trees. In the span of a heartbeat, he was gone, as if the forest had swallowed him whole. She looked down at the palm leaf. The symbols shifted subtly when she blinked, rearranging themselves into a circle like the one she'd seen on her camera. The faint scent of smoke lingered. She turned toward the bell tower. The bell gleamed faintly now, though clouds covered the sun. Something inside it moved. Her hands trembled. She stepped closer, the palm leaf clenched tight in her fist. For a moment, she thought she saw her own reflection in the metal. Then, behind it, the shape of someone standing, bald, still, and waiting. A whisper rippled through the air, soft and heavy with meaning she couldn't translate. It wasn't Thai. It wasn't Pali. It was something older. The bell rang once. The palm leaf in her hand turned cold, and though she didn't move her lips, she heard her own voice answer from inside the echo.
The rain came suddenly, not with thunder or storm, but a quiet, steady drizzle that soaked through the leaves and turned the temple stones slick with moss. Arisa stood beneath the bell tower, unmoving. The whisper had faded, but the feeling it left behind lingered inside her like breath on a mirror. Chilling, fragile, impossible to ignore. She turned the palm leaf over in her hand again. The script had faded. What had once shimmered with subtle energy now looked like nothing more than smudged ink. She tucked it carefully into her notebook, though she sensed it would no longer protect her. Still, she couldn't leave. There was something beneath the bell, a pull, not physical, but deep, magnetic. Her dreams, the chanting, the soot, the monk's words, it all pointed to one place, the seal. She stepped into the bell tower. The stone steps creaked beneath her weight, and her fingers brushed the cold walls as she climbed. She moved slowly, as though the air itself resisted her presence. At the top, the bronze bell loomed, motionless, its surface slick from the rain mist. Beneath it, the wooden platform had darkened over time, warped and split in places. But one of the cracks stood out, a seam that didn't belong. She knelt and ran her hand across it. The grain felt unnatural, too perfect, as if it had been placed there not by nature or decay, but by purpose. Then she saw it. A thin groove, nearly invisible, curved in a circle beneath the bell's base. Symbols had been carved into the wood, crude and worn, but unmistakably ritualistic. Some matched the script on the palm leaf. She reached into her bag for her flashlight and shone it through the crack. Below, a hollow space, just large enough to fit a body. Her stomach twisted. This was no foundation, it was a crypt. She hesitated only a moment longer before she pried her fingers under the edge of the rotten wood. It resisted, then gave way with a dry crack. The air that rushed up from below was foul, thick with mildew, old incense, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like blood dried a century ago and left to rot. She pulled the panel aside. Darkness yawned beneath her. A narrow shaft, just deep enough for a coffin or a kneeling man. She lowered the flashlight. What she saw turned her skin to ice,
A figure, still and crumpled, wrapped in ceremonial robes that were once saffron, but were now stained black. The body sat in a fetal position, its skin stretched tight over bone. Its lips were sewn shut with red thread, the same kind she'd seen in the mural. Around its neck, a rosary of human teeth, and clutched in its decaying hands, another bell, smaller, cracked, but identical. Arisa fell back, gagging. Her flashlight clattered against the floor, rolling into the shadows. The silence inside the tower turned dense. The only sound was her heartbeat, and beneath it, something new. Breathing. She scrambled backward, eyes wide. The body hadn't moved, but the air had changed. The ritual circle she had disturbed glowed faintly, lines pulsing with soft red light. Then, the bell in the corpse's hands rang. Not loud, just once. A brittle, dry note that echoed inside her skull. She screamed and ran. Down the stairs, past the murals, past the headless Buddha whose cloth now burned faintly at the edges. Out into the rain, into the trees. Her legs ached, her lungs heaved. She didn't know how far she ran, only that she didn't stop until the temple was out of sight. Only then did she fall to her knees. Mud swallowed her hands as she tried to breathe, but her thoughts kept circling one truth. She had broken the seal. It wasn't just that the bell rang again. It rang because she had freed it. That night, back at the guest house, her camera was waiting for her. She hadn't brought it. No one else had entered her room, but there it was, perched on the desk. The power light blinked red. The screen flickered to life as she picked it up, showing a single new video file, unlabeled, time-stamped just after noon, when she was still at the tower. Her hands trembled as she pressed play. The video opened in darkness, then slowly, faint torchlight revealed the inside of the crypt, the corpse of the monk, the bell in his hands. But this time, it was moving. Not the body, the shadow behind it. A figure stood just beyond the ring of light, cloaked in shifting smoke. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. Arisa felt it watching her through the lens. The camera panned slowly toward the surface of the small bell, and there, etched around its rim, was her name. Spelt in full, in perfect, unbroken Thai. She dropped the camera. Her hands were black with soot again. She ran to the mirror. There, just beneath her jawline, barely visible in the dim light, was the faint outline of thread marks, as if someone had tried to sew her lips shut and stopped halfway. The next morning began with silence, but not the peaceful kind. This silence was dense, suffocating, the kind that presses against the eardrums and makes every breath feel stolen. The birds outside the guest house had vanished. The dogs that usually barked through the night were nowhere to be heard. Even the villagers had stopped moving. Arisa stood in front of the bathroom mirror, tracing her fingertips across the skin just beneath her jaw. The faint marks remained, thin red impressions like faded scars or the ghost of thread pulled too tightly. They hadn't been there before. She tried to convince herself they were just stress rashes or insect bites, but part of her already knew. The bell had marked her. Her phone was still dead. The charger had melted slightly at the port, blackened as if scorched from the inside. The power in the guest house had flickered throughout the night, each outage accompanied by a distant sound, a deep metallic hum that rose through the walls. The owner claimed it was just the storm, but Arisa hadn't seen a single drop of rain, only the smell of smoke and incense. She didn't remember falling asleep,
But when she woke, she was fully dressed, her shoes muddy, her nails caked in ash. There were footprints on the floor, her own, but they led in from the outside. And her camera was missing. Again. At noon, the bell rang. She wasn't at Wat Sawan. She was still in the village, walking near the edge of the jungle, when the sound rolled through the air like a foghorn underwater. It shouldn't have reached this far. Not with that clarity, not with that weight. Every villager froze. Some crossed themselves. Others dropped what they were holding. But no one looked toward the trees. Only Arisa did. And she saw the bell tower just barely through the canopy. Its outline was darker than the sky, and it was swaying. But the wind wasn't blowing. She returned to her room in a daze. The camera had been placed neatly on her bed, facing the pillow. It was turned on, lens cap off, recording nothing but static. When she reviewed the file, she heard it again, chanting, reversed and layered. Her own voice, muttering in a language she didn't know, and beneath it, a second voice, older, broken, smiling. The monk. She could feel his presence in the room now, like a weight in the corner of her vision. She didn't dare look too long into the shadows. She didn't dare close the bathroom door. Desperation took hold. She opened every image and video file she had stored from Wat Sawan. Most were corrupted, glitched, but a few had remained intact, and one, taken from the altar room, showed something she hadn't noticed before. A doorway. Not a real one. A carving, hidden behind overgrown vines on the temple's inner wall. A circle of symbols surrounding a central motif of a monk kneeling, his shadow bound to a bell above him with strings running from his mouth into the sky. There was something etched beside it, so small the lens had barely picked it up. She enhanced it using a photo editing tool. A phrase, "To still the soul, the bell must feed." She whispered the words, and the room grew colder. Something in her chest twisted, like breath catching between heartbeats. It wasn't metaphor, it was instruction. She had fed the bell. The seal she had broken wasn't just symbolic, it was a doorway, a vessel, a hunger, and it had tasted her. She fled the guest house that evening, with nothing but her bag, the cursed camera, and the palm leaf charm that no longer glowed. The villagers didn't stop her. They watched her, as if they knew she was no longer entirely human. She returned to Wat Sawan under a blood-colored sky. The jungle parted like it remembered her. Even the vines seemed to lean away from her touch. The temple was exactly as she left it, except now the bell tower wasn't just watching, it was listening. Inside, the murals had changed again. The monks no longer faced demons. They were kneeling before the bell, weeping, their mouths sewn shut. The one in the center, Pra Anulom, she now understood, was smiling. She heard a sound and turned. Her camera hanging from her shoulder was recording again, automatically. She didn't press anything. And in the live preview, she saw something that wasn't there in reality. The room, full of monks, rows of them, kneeling in silence, eyes black and mouths sealed, all facing her. And behind them, the spirit. Smoke, shaped like a man, holding the smaller bell, watching, waiting. The feed cut out. The bell above her rang once. She dropped to her knees, not by choice. Her legs had gone numb. A whisper crawled into her ear, cold and slick. "You opened the way." Tears rolled down her face, because somewhere inside she knew what came next. She had heard the bell. Now she would become it.
Long before the forest reclaimed Wat Sawan, before the roots of the banyan trees split open its foundation, the temple had been a place of peace. Monks came from distant provinces to study here, drawn by whispers of a teacher said to walk between worlds. His name was Pra-Anulam, a scholar of chants, a man whose voice was said to calm storms and silence restless spirits. But the kingdom was not at peace. The rains had failed, famine spread, and villages fell into madness. When the first deaths came, unnatural, sudden, unclean, the villagers turned to the temple for help. Corpses were found sitting upright, their eyes wide open, mouths frozen in screams. Livestock fled into the jungle and never returned. Children spoke of hearing a bell toll in the middle of the night. The abbot of Wat Sawan sent monks to bless the land, to burn incense and chant sutras. None of them came back. It was Pra-Anulam who finally descended into the jungle alone. He returned 7 days later, changed. His eyes were hollow but bright, as if carrying fire within. His robe was torn, and in his hand he held a bronze bell, unlike any seen before, covered in inscriptions written backward, its handle shaped like a lotus bud rotting from the stem. He spoke little of what he had seen, only saying, "It is not a ghost that haunts us. It is grief given form." From that day onward, he began constructing a ritual of binding, Katasat, the forbidden mantra. Other monks protested. The chant required sacrifice, a vessel, a human soul willingly sealed as the anchor for the spirit. Pra-Anulam volunteered himself. He claimed the ritual was mercy. He said no one else could bear the weight. On the 7th moon of the harvest season, as villagers gathered outside the temple walls, he began the ceremony. Incense smoke filled the courtyard. Monks knelt in circles, chanting the sutra of stilling. Pra-Anulam sat in the center before the great bell. Around him were 6 jars filled with rice, ash, and blood, offerings to each of the realms. He recited the binding mantra, his voice low and rhythmic, each word drawing closer to silence. The spirit came with the wind. It arrived as a whisper first, then a howl, a shape without form, born of all who had died in anger. It tore through the courtyard, unseen but felt, breath freezing, lungs burning, shadows stretching thin. The younger monks fled, but Pra-Anulam did not move. He struck the bell once, and the sound cut through the chaos like a blade. The spirit screamed. It rushed toward him. He continued chanting. The bell vibrated, the inscriptions glowing red. Blood trickled from his nose, his mouth, and ears, but he did not stop. The sound grew unbearable. Windows shattered, trees bent. The villagers outside the temple fell to their knees, pressing their hands over their ears. Then, with one final breath, Pra-Anulam spoke the final word of the chant, an ancient syllable no longer known to man. The bell cracked. The wind stopped. Silence fell over Wat Sawan. When the monks dared to look again, Pra-Anulam was gone. Only his robe remained, folded neatly before the bell. The other monks wept and began to rebuild the altar in his memory. But as they lifted the bell to move it, it rang once, softly, and from beneath it they heard a sound. Breathing. They uncovered the earth below and found him, kneeling in a pit, his body rigid but alive. His skin was darkened like lacquer, his lips sewn shut with crimson thread. Yet his eyes were open, moving, following their every motion. He had bound the spirit, yes, but in doing so, he had bound himself. Days turned to weeks, then months. His body did not decay, his heart did not stop. The monks built the tower over him, sealing the bell above his head to contain the curse.
It was said that he continued to chant beneath the earth, silently, endlessly, holding the spirit inside the space between sound and breath. The years turned to decades. The temple emptied, the jungle grew. The monks who knew his name died one by one. Yet the bell remained, and when villagers wandered too close, they said they could hear it ring at dusk, once, always once. That was how they knew the spirit of Pra Anulam still lingered, not as a man, not as a ghost, but as something caught between mercy and damnation. A monk who would not die, a voice that could never stop, and a bell that waited for someone foolish enough to listen.
Arisa awoke in the forest, curled beneath the roots of a banyan tree. The earth was damp beneath her, and the sky above bled into twilight. She didn't remember walking there. She didn't remember sleeping. Her last memory was of the bell ringing, soft, too soft for others to hear, yet it had cracked something deep inside her. She sat up slowly. Her mouth was dry. Her limbs ached as if they had carried her for miles. Her fingers were stained black, not with dirt, but with soot, and clutched in her palm, like a forgotten gift, was the palm leaf charm. It had burned through. Only ash remained. The path back to the village was silent. The trees no longer whispered. They watched. The wind had stopped. Even the insects had gone still. She reached the edge of the jungle by nightfall, only to find the village darker than before. No fires burned. No lights flickered behind wooden shutters. The doors were closed, the windows sealed. It was as if the village had exhaled its last breath and was now holding it in. A young girl stood barefoot in the road. Arisa approached her cautiously. "Where is everyone?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The girl didn't answer at first. She stared at Arisa's throat. "Your voice is different now. It has an echo." She blinked. "What do you mean?" "You've been touched, marked by the toll." And then she ran. Arisa stumbled back to the guest house. Her room had not been disturbed, but it felt wrong, colder. The mirror was covered with a cloth she didn't place. When she pulled it down, she saw the truth she had been avoiding. Her reflection no longer followed her exactly. Her lips moved a second after she spoke. Her eyes blinked out of sync, and around her neck, beneath the skin, was the faint outline of thread deepening. In panic, she began researching everything she could on the spirit-binding rituals, on Wat Sawan, on monks who would become vessels. She found obscure texts, hidden articles in forums for Southeast Asian occultists, and translated fragments from palm leaf manuscripts. All of them spoke of the mantra of binding, a ritual used in ancient times to contain spirits too violent to be allowed passage into the next life. The mantra, once begun, could only be completed by the original chanter. If interrupted, the vessel remained in limbo, half human, half prison. The spirit within would hunger, would search for another voice to continue the chant, to finish what was broken. The symptoms of the marked were clear. Soot in the breath, thread-like markings around the mouth, speech in reversed tongues during sleep, an inability to forget the sound of the bell. Arisa had all of them. There was one final note in the manuscript. "If thou be chosen by the toll, thy voice shall echo twice. The first echo is warning, the second is possession." She covered her mouth with her hand. What had she said in the recordings? She opened her camera and reviewed the files. The first video showed her standing before the bell tower, speaking backward in a chant she could not recognize. But what chilled her most was her eyes. They were open, unblinking, utterly still, as if something else was inside.
The second video, time-stamped just minutes later, showed her kneeling, alone, and laughing. Except the laugh did not sound human. It was brittle, echoing, too deep. Behind her, the image shimmered. The bell, and the monk, watching, waiting. She slammed the camera shut and turned toward the mirror. Her reflection smiled before she did. The next day, she visited the old forest monk again. He was waiting at the tree line, as if he knew she would come.
"You broke the seal,"
he said. "I didn't mean to." He nodded. "The spirit doesn't care about intent. It only listens for weakness, regret, curiosity. Those are doorways." "Then help me close it. How do I stop it?" He studied her a long moment. "You can't. Not anymore." She stepped back. "What do you mean?" "You've heard the toll twice. You're no longer alone in your skin." Tears welled in her eyes. "There must be something." The monk exhaled slowly and knelt. From within the folds of his robe, he retrieved an old, rusted amulet, shaped like a bell, cracked down the center. "This will slow it, but not forever." She clutched it with trembling hands. "Why me?" she asked. His gaze was sorrowful. "Because you listened." That night, she dreamed again. The monks knelt in circles, mouths sewn. The spirit walked among them, trailing smoke. It touched each of their heads one by one and whispered a name. When it reached her, it leaned close, and in a voice she recognized as her own, it whispered, "The bell tolls for those who speak too soon, and those who wake the silence." She awoke choking on soot. Her lips had begun to stiffen, and the bell was no longer just in her dreams. It was inside her.
The forest no longer waited for nightfall to whisper. It had begun speaking to her in daylight. In the spaces between trees, in the stillness of the leaves, there was always a sound, faint, breathless, like chanting spoken from beneath water. Arisa walked with her head bowed, one hand clenched around the cracked amulet, the other gripping her camera like a lifeline. She no longer carried it to record. She carried it because she had to. Every time she tried to leave it behind, it returned. On her bed, in her bag, once inside the temple ruins before she'd even arrived. The forest remembered her, and now it echoed her. When she whispered, it whispered back. When she wept, the leaves around her trembled with a sound like sighing. The markings on her skin had grown, no longer faint impressions. Now they were lines, red and raw, circling her mouth like delicate wire pressed into flesh. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Food turned to ash in her throat. Water passed through her, but it didn't touch her hunger, because the hunger wasn't physical. It was spiritual. She felt it growing inside her, a hollow, a ringing, like something waiting to be filled. She returned to Wat Sawan at dusk, unable to resist the pull, but the temple was no longer just ruins. As she stepped into the clearing, the forest shimmered and the world shifted. The vines receded, the stones reassembled themselves, the murals brightened. The headless Buddha had a face now, eyes closed in sorrow, mouth sewn shut in silent prayer. Monks moved in and out of doorways, their feet not touching the ground. She wasn't seeing the past, she was being drawn into it. And in the center of it all, the bell. It no longer hung still, it pulsed, breathing. She stepped forward, camera at her side, her own breath syncing with the bell's rhythm. A voice whispered through the trees, not loud, but unmistakable. "Repeat after me." She didn't know the language, but her lips began to move, unwilling, soundless.
forming syllables in reverse. The ground beneath her flickered. She saw herself standing in the crypt, looking down at the corpse of Pra Anulom. Then she saw herself beside him, kneeling, her mouth sewn, her hands clasped in prayer. The two images overlapped. She was becoming both. She stumbled backward, gasping, and fell to her knees in the mud. The forest snapped back to ruin, dark, broken, lifeless. But the echo remained, not just in her ears, in her body. She took out her phone. Somehow, impossibly, the battery had returned to life. There was a new voice memo, time-stamped 10 minutes ago. She hadn't recorded anything, but she pressed play. Her own voice filled the air, slow, measured, speaking in reverse, layered with a second voice, low, raspy, inhuman. Each syllable carved through her like a knife through wet cloth. Then silence, then a final whisper. "You are the mouthpiece now." She dropped the phone, clutched at her throat, and screamed, but no sound came out. She ran again, into the trees, away from the temple, but the forest had changed. The path was gone. Every turn led her back to the same place, the bell tower, and inside it, her camera sat waiting on the ground, pointed at the altar, recording. She approached with trembling steps, lifted the screen. In the frame, herself, but not as she was now, as she would become, kneeling, silent, stitched, holding the bell. She turned off the camera, sat down in the grass, and cried, because there was no escaping the echo anymore. She wasn't just hearing the chant, she was completing it, piece by piece, word by word. The mantra of binding wasn't only about trapping a spirit, it was about becoming its voice. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat beneath the trees watching the sky, and every so often the forest whispered her name. But not once, twice, always twice, as if calling and then answering. By the third day without sleep, Arisa no longer trusted the boundaries of her thoughts. She moved like a shadow, drifting between the waking world and something else, a layer beneath reality where nothing breathed, nothing blinked, and nothing died. The village had turned to stone. No one looked at her anymore. Children hid behind doors. Adults walked with salt on their thresholds and black string around their wrists. They knew. She was no longer just a visitor. She was marked, not only by the bell, but by the ritual itself. And the ritual was hungry. She returned to Wat Sawan without fear this time. There was nothing left to fear. It had already made its offering. Now came the surrender. The temple greeted her in silence. The murals shimmered faintly, not in sunlight, but in awareness. Their eyes followed her. Their mouths, though sewn shut, moved when she wasn't looking. The threads were wet now, fresh, and they led toward the altar, like veins drawing toward a heart. Arisa stepped inside the inner chamber. The altar had changed. 3 new bowls had been placed where once there had been dust and ruin. Inside the first, ash. Inside the second, nails. Inside the third, blood. Hers. The cut on her hand, shallow, a scrape from a vine 2 days ago, had somehow fed the third bowl. The blood was dark and clotted, yet warm, as if it had just been poured. She staggered back, her breathing shallow, but she didn't scream. She understood now. The ritual wasn't passive. It collected. Every fear, every cut, every breath in the wrong place. It was building towards something. a climax, a consumption. Then came the bell, a soft toll, but this time not from above. It came from beneath her, from the crypt. The sound rippled through her bones like an ancient memory. Her legs moved without her permission. She walked to the cracked foundation. The wood she'd torn weeks before was gone. In its place, an open hole, wide enough now for her to enter. A staircase of stone led downward, carved into the belly of the earth. She followed. Torchlight flared without flame. A line of flickering lamps lit the path ahead. And at the bottom, the chamber. It was circular, carved from black stone, etched with reversed mantras and names long erased. At its center stood the bell of Pra Anulom, the smaller one, the one once held by his corpse. It now floated inches above the ground, spinning slowly, waiting. And around it, 6 relics had been placed: a bowl of teeth, a severed braid of black hair, a cracked mirror, a funerary coin, a lotus flower drowned in ink, and a 7th space, still empty. She knew without being told what it needed: her voice. She stepped forward, lips trembling. The threads around her mouth had grown tighter. When she opened her mouth, smoke escaped, not breath, not sound, just a whisper of something older than speech. The bell rang again. She dropped to her knees, and then it spoke. Not aloud, not with words, but inside her. A presence, cold, vast, ancient. It showed her visions of all the mouths it had silenced, all the souls it had swallowed, monks, strangers, children who wandered too far into the woods, women who heard the bell and followed its sound in dreams. They were all here now, trapped in the metal, singing without voices, praying without gods. Arisa wept, but the tears were not her own. The bell was crying through her. The floor began to shake. The 7th space on the altar began to pulse. The ritual was not waiting, it was demanding. She stood. She stepped into the circle, and she offered her voice. She opened her mouth wide. The chant came from somewhere else, a language older than prayer, spoken in reverse, bound in pain. Her lips moved on their own, her throat burned, and then the altar exploded in light, searing white, endless. The bell screamed. She screamed. The chamber roared with 1,000 voices, all layered, all chanting, all trying to finish the same phrase, one mantra, unfinished for 100 years. And now, she was the end of it. When it was over, she lay on the stone floor. Her mouth no longer bled, but it was sealed. No stitches, no thread, just skin, as if her lips had never existed. And beside her, the bell had stopped spinning. Arisa had no mouth, and yet she screamed. The sound existed only inside her skull, an endless, echoing loop of horror, disbelief, and the lingering tremor of the chant that had just poured through her like liquid ash. She lay motionless on the cold stone floor of the crypt, breath coming in shallow gasps through her nose. Her body was slick with sweat, but her limbs were numb. Her chest felt hollow, her throat burned, and her heart pulsed with a rhythm no longer her own. It matched the bell. 1 beat, 2 beats, silence, then the echo. A cadence older than time. She tried to stand, but her legs folded beneath her. Blood, or what felt like blood, dripped from her ears. Her eyes stung, and something new had begun to stir beneath her skin. The chant was still there, but it wasn't a memory. It was continuing, over and over, a whisper inside her that never ended. She wasn't just marked now. She was carrying the ritual. A vessel, a bridge, a voice for a mantra too cursed to be forgotten. She crawled from the chamber, fingers scraping the ancient stone. The forest above had changed again. Night had fallen, but the moon was blood red, and the trees leaned inward like listeners at a sermon. The temple ruins shimmered as though caught between centuries. Some walls stood tall, others remained collapsed. She was walking through layers of time now, phases of the temple stitched together by the chant she carried. The bell tower glowed faintly, not with light, but with presence, as if it were awake, watching. She stumbled back to the altar hall. The bowls were gone. In their place, 7 small clay jars, sealed with wax and string, rested in a perfect circle. She knew what they were. She didn't need to be told. Pra Anulam's relics. 1 for each offering. 1 for each syllable of the final chant. And she was the 8th. The end. On the wall behind the altar, a mural she hadn't seen before had revealed itself. It was freshly painted, impossible but real. It depicted a woman kneeling before a bell, her mouth sewn shut, her hands raised not in prayer, but in surrender. Around her, ghostly monks bowed, and above them, the sky was split open, darkness pouring down like water. At the top of the mural, a single line of reversed script. To bind is to become is to vanish. She touched the words. They were still wet. Then came the voice. Not the bell, not the monks. Pra Anulam. He spoke through the air, through the stone, through the very blood in her body. You have called it. Now you must complete it, or the toll will pass to someone else. She saw it then, the consequence. If she failed to complete the chant, if she did not seal it, it would pass to the next voice that heard the bell. A child, a stranger, a village, a world. The ritual had waited too long. The spirit inside was hungry. It would spread like ash in the wind unless contained. There was one final step. She had to return to the crypt, to the altar, and recite the sealed chant, the full mantra, complete it where Pra Anulam could not. Only then would the binding close. Only then would the bell fall silent forever. She descended the stairs one last time. The relics followed her, floating gently in the air, circling her like silent witnesses. Inside the chamber, the bell hovered above the altar, cracked and glowing. But it did not ring. It was listening, waiting. She knelt, her mouth still sealed, but her soul knew the words. She closed her eyes, and the chant began, not with breath, but with will. It was not spoken. It was released, like smoke from a lantern, like light from a flame. The relics burned away one by one. The air pulsed with heat. The chamber trembled. The symbols on the walls spun, and the bell wept. It did not toll. It wept. And when the final word passed through her heart, the crack in the bell sealed. A single, dull thud echoed through the crypt, the kind of sound that marks endings. Arisa collapsed, not unconscious, not dead, but emptied. The chant was over, but so was she. Her voice would never return. The bell had taken it. But the curse was sealed.
When Arisa woke, there was no sound, not the rustle of wind, not the breath of trees, not even the echo of her own heartbeat. It was as if the world itself had paused, waiting. She sat slowly, her body hollow but intact. The crypt around her no longer pulsed with otherworldly light. The walls had darkened, the altar had cracked, and the bell, the cursed bell, was gone. Only dust remained. Dust and silence. And yet, within her chest, something still stirred. A tremor, soft and slow, like a drumbeat beneath her ribs. The ritual was complete, but the echo had not fully faded. She climbed the steps out of the crypt barefoot now, her shoes lost somewhere in the descent. The temple above had collapsed again. No more glowing murals, no more shifting walls. The monks were gone. Only ruin remained. The vines had returned to their place. The jungle, once held back by the ritual, had begun to reclaim what had been disturbed. Wat Sawan was once again asleep. But Arisa was not. She made the journey back to the village in silence. No one came to greet her. The villagers had seen this before. The toll of the bell could never be unheard. Those who returned always came back different, if they returned at all. She passed homes with doors shut and salt poured thick along thresholds. And when she reached her guest house, she found her room untouched, as though no time had passed, as though she had never left. The mirror was covered again. She didn't uncover it. She didn't need to see what she had become. That night, Arisa dreamed without color. In her dream, she stood in the center of the jungle where the bell tower once stood. But it was no longer a tower. It was a mouth, open and yawning, exhaling ash into the sky. The ground pulsed with names, every victim of the chant, every voice that had fed the ritual. And standing across from her was herself, but older, pale, eyes hollow, lips gone. The woman raised a hand, not in warning, but in offering. In her palm, a new bell, smaller, unmarked, untouched, waiting. Arisa woke with her hand clenched around something cold. She opened her fingers. The bell from her dream. Real, solid, perfect. She didn't scream. She had no voice to scream with. Only the breathless understanding that the ritual hadn't taken her voice. It had traded it. What had been sealed in the crypt was a fragment, a tether, but the hunger remained. And now, she was its vessel. Not the curse, not the prisoner, but the keeper.
the final guardian of the chant, to ensure it never spread, to ensure it never woke again. So she walked into the forest once more, past the shrine, past the old stone gate, back to the place where no wind blew, and she buried the bell, deep beneath the roots of the oldest banyan tree, wrapped in the palm leaf scroll the monk had once given her, bound with black thread pulled from her own hair, an offering, a warning, a lullaby for the restless dead. She carved no name into the ground, placed no marker, left no sign, because those who needed to find it would, and those who didn't would never know the silence that once wept from the bell. When she returned to the village, she packed her things and left without a word. There was nothing left to say. The forest watched her go, and behind her, deep in the earth, beneath the roots, the bell did not ring. But if you listened closely enough, you might still hear it breathing.
Beneath the earth, where sound forgets to travel, beyond the reach of prayer or time, he waited. Pra Anulom had never truly died. His body had dried and folded, yes. His skin had darkened like aged lacquer, yes. But death, true death, had never come, because the chant had never ended, because he had never let go. The monks who buried him thought they were honoring sacrifice, but the truth was more complicated. Pra Anulom had not offered himself out of virtue. He had offered himself out of guilt. Long before the curse plagued Wat Sawan, he had discovered the mantra, not in scriptures, not in temples, but in a forbidden cave shrine deep in the northern hills, where ancient monks once practiced spiritual binding through silence and suffering. He had been warned not to speak the words aloud, but he had, and something had heard him. It had followed him back to the temple. It had waited. And when the deaths began, when the bell tolled in the night and the dead refused to lie still, Pra Anulom did not confess. He performed the ritual. He wrote the chant, reversed it, twisted it, added his blood, added his name. And at the final moment, he chose not a disciple, not an offering, but himself. Because no one else knew what he had done. Because if the curse ended with him, then the truth would stay buried. But the curse did not end. The chant, unfinished, had fractured him, left his body bound, but his spirit adrift, neither prisoner nor guardian, a monk whose voice still echoed beneath the bell long after the world had moved on. And then Arisa came, a girl who listened too closely, a soul unarmored by ritual, raw with curiosity, open with sorrow. He had felt her long before she touched the seal, felt her breath in the soil above, felt her doubt, felt her grief. And when she opened the crypt, he smiled, not out of malice, but out of hope. Because where he had failed to finish the chant, perhaps she would not. He had watched her struggle, watched her tremble, watched her lips blacken with the marks of the toll, and still she chose to finish it. She did what he could not. She sealed the hunger, bound the spirit, silenced the chant. But in doing so, she had unknowingly taken his place. She had become the new vessel, the new echo.
Now in the crypt that no longer shimmered with smoke, his spirit waited quietly, not bound, not cursed, not anymore, free. And yet he did not rise, he did not leave, because someone still had to listen. Someone had to remain in the space between silence and tolling, to watch the shadows, to feel the tremors in the roots, to warn the next soul who stepped too close. So Pra Anulam waited, not as prisoner, not as monster, not as monk, but as memory, as the final guardian of a silence too heavy for one person alone, because he knew the truth. The bell never disappears, it simply finds a new mouth.
Years passed. The temple of Wat Sawan was reclaimed fully by the forest. Rain dissolved the remaining murals. Vines choked the bell tower until it collapsed into the earth. The paths disappeared beneath moss and root. Locals no longer spoke of it. They taught their children to walk different trails, to cover their ears at night, to never follow a sound they could not explain. But still, sometimes, just after sundown, a single note echoed from deep within the jungle. A bell, faint, lonely, calling. Arisa was never seen again. Her name faded from university records. Her thesis project remained incomplete. Her guest house room was emptied and sealed. The villagers claimed she had gone home. The truth, they knew, was different. She had become part of the silence. Far away, in another village, in another province, a young girl woke from a dream. She had heard chanting, and in her hand was a camera, old, dusty, dead. But when her mother tried to turn it on, it blinked, once. The screen flickered, and for a brief second it showed a face, a woman kneeling, lips sealed by thread, a bell in her hands. The girl began to hum, not a song, not a lullaby, a chant, backwards, soft, in a voice far older than her years. Her mother asked her what it meant. The girl tilted her head, eyes distant, as if listening to something far away, and then she whispered, "She told me to keep it safe. She said the bell was sleeping, but it doesn't like to be forgotten." In the forest, beneath the oldest banyan tree, the soil shifted. A breeze passed with no source, and from beneath the earth came the softest sound. Not a toll, not a scream, a whisper, calling for a voice, waiting for a name. Because the bell does not hunger, it remembers. And when silence stretches too long, when someone listens too closely, when grief finds no place to go, the bell will whisper again, and someone will answer.